She ate after everyone else. Sometimes, not at all. It never looked unusual from the outside. There was always food on the table, plates were filled, conversations carried on, laughter moved easily across the room, and somewhere in between all of that, she existed. Not as part of it, just around it. A shadow passing through moments that didn't belong to her. If you had walked into that house, you wouldn't have noticed anything missing. Everything appeared in order, clean floors, organized spaces, a life that seemed complete. But order can be misleading, because sometimes what's absent isn't visible. It's felt, slowly, over time. A chair that's never offered, a voice that's never asked for, a presence that's never fully acknowledged. And when something is consistently ignored, it begins to disappear without ever leaving. She learned the rhythm of that house, when to move, when to speak, when silence was safer than being heard. She understood the weight of footsteps on the stairs, the meaning behind doors closing, the difference between being called and being summoned. And in that understanding, she adapted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remain unnoticeable. Because in that space, being unnoticed wasn't an accident. It was an expectation. Days turned into weeks, weeks folded into years, and nothing seemed to change. The same routines, the same voices, the same quiet distance that followed her from room to room. But something else was changing. Something no one was paying attention to. Not in her hands, which continued to work. Not in her voice, which remained steady and controlled, but in her awareness. Because when a person is placed on the edges of everything, they begin to see what others overlook. Patterns, repetition, behavior that reveals more than words ever could. She noticed who spoke with respect and who never tried, who looked through her and who avoided looking at all, who assumed she would always be there, exactly where they left her. And over time, those small observations stopped being small. They started to build, quietly, patiently, until they formed something solid. Not anger, not resentment. Something more precise. Understanding. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that waits. And then one day, without warning, without explanation, she was gone. No confrontation, no final words. Just an absence. That didn't seem important at first. Because when someone has been treated like they don't matter, their disappearance rarely feels urgent. Life continued, the same routines, the same conversations, the same sense of everything being exactly as it should be, until time began to pass, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Not in the house, but in what had been taken for granted, because absence has a way of revealing value long after it's gone. Years later, a car pulled up in front of that same house, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, just enough to be noticed. And when the door opened, the past didn't return the way they remembered it. It had changed, refined, elevated, unrecognizable. She stepped out, no longer moving around the edges of someone else's life, no longer waiting to be acknowledged. She carried something different now, something that didn't need permission to exist, and in that moment, everything they failed to see stood right in front of them, clear, undeniable, too late to question, too late to rewrite. Years later, she came back richer than all of them combined, and by then, it was too late to apologize. Before we begin, if stories like this speak to you, the kind that reveal what people go through in silence, take a second to click the subscribe button, because some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to stay with you. Her name was Elena, but in that house, names didn't matter. They were unnecessary. Labels only existed for people who were meant to be remembered, and she wasn't. She was positioned differently, carefully, intentionally, always present, but never included. Invisible wasn't something that happened to her over time. It was built into the role from the beginning, a quiet understanding, unspoken, but enforced in everything. Clean this. You missed a spot. Don't touch that. The words were never harsh enough to raise concern, never loud enough to sound alarming, but they carried something else. Distance. They weren't conversations. They didn't invite response. They didn't require acknowledgement. They were instructions, delivered with the assumption that she would follow them and disappear again. And she did, at first. Because Elena came from a place where opportunity didn't come twice. A small, quiet town where people measured life in what was available, not in what was possible. She had learned early that survival often meant accepting what was offered without asking too many questions. So when the job came, it felt like movement, like progress, a large house, steady work, a structure that seemed stable. It looked like a step forward, and for a while, she treated it that way. She worked carefully, deliberately, not just to do things right, but to avoid doing anything wrong. Because in that house, mistakes weren't corrected, they were remembered, and slowly, she began to understand the environment she had stepped into, not through explanation, but through repetition. The way conversations would lower, just slightly, when she entered a room. The way eye contact never fully settled on her, as if acknowledging her too directly would disrupt something. The way her presence was accepted, but never recognized. It wasn't aggressive. That's what made it harder to define. Everything operated within normal boundaries, polite enough to avoid attention, but consistent enough to shape reality. She wasn't being pushed out. She was being kept, exactly where she was. In between, not outside the house, but never inside its world. And over time, that space became familiar. She learned the timing of everything, when the kitchen needed to be empty, when the living room needed to be perfect, when to move quickly, and when to move quietly. She adjusted her footsteps, softened her presence, reduced anything that might draw attention, because attention was never a good thing. It didn't bring connection. It brought correction. And correction meant being seen in a way she couldn't control. So she chose something else: precision. She became exact in her movements, measured in her actions, not out of fear alone, but out of understanding. Because by then, she had started to notice something deeper. The structure of the house wasn't just physical, it was social, emotional, carefully layered. Everyone had a place, a position, a level of importance, and hers had already been decided, not through a conversation, not through a single moment, but through a pattern that repeated itself day after day, without interruption. And once a pattern goes unchallenged long enough, it becomes truth, at least to the people who benefit from it. But Elena wasn't just moving through that pattern anymore. She was observing it, quietly, carefully, the same way she had learned everything else. Because when someone is placed on the edges of a system, they gain a perspective no one at the center ever needs. They see the gaps, the assumptions, the things that go unquestioned. And those observations don't disappear. They stay. They collect. They wait. And while nothing about her role seemed to change, while the same instructions echoed through the same rooms, something else was forming. Not visible. Not obvious, but steady. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself until it's already complete, and by the time anyone notices, it's already too late to go back to the way things were. The woman of the house never looked her in the eye. It wasn't accidental. It was consistent, practiced, a glance that stopped just short of connection, a presence acknowledged only when something needed to be corrected, as if recognition itself was something to be rationed. And Elena learned quickly that she wasn't worth spending it on. The children treated her like background noise, not out of intention at first, but out of imitation. They repeated what they saw, the tone, the distance, the quiet permission to disregard. They didn't question it, they absorbed it. Because in that house, behavior didn't need to be explained, it just needed to be observed. They made messes just to watch her clean them, Small things at first, a glass tipped slightly too far, crumbs scattered where they didn't belong, nothing that couldn't be fixed in seconds. But that wasn't the point. They weren't testing her ability to clean, they were testing her position, watching how quickly she responded, how silently she corrected, how easily she erased what they created. And every time she did, without protest, it confirmed something to them, that she would always be there, to fix, to adjust, to disappear again. They laughed when she slipped, not loudly, not cruelly enough to draw attention, just enough to share the moment between themselves, a quiet amusement, as if her imbalance was entertainment, and Elena heard it. Every time, even when she pretended she didn't, because sound travels differently when you're the subject of it. They tested how far they could go, and like most things in that house, the limit wasn't set by rules, it was set by her reaction, or rather, her lack of one. Because Elena didn't argue, didn't correct, didn't push back, not because she didn't feel it, but because she understood something early. In certain environments, defending yourself doesn't restore balance, it disrupts it, and disruption has consequences. And the man of the house, he ignored her, in a way that felt deliberate, not dismissive, not careless, measured. As if acknowledging her too much would require something in return, so he chose distance, a controlled absence, until the day he didn't. It wasn't a dramatic shift, no sudden change in behavior, no visible signal that anything was different. Just a moment, that extended longer than it should have. A pause, that didn't follow the usual pattern, and in that pause, the structure she had learned to navigate shifted, slightly, but enough. That night, everything appeared the same. The house remained quiet, the rooms stayed in order, the routine continued without interruption. From the outside, nothing had changed, and that's what made it harder to define. Because some moments don't announce themselves, they don't break through the surface, they settle beneath it, unseen, unspoken, but permanent. There were no witnesses, no raised voices, no visible damage, just an interaction that crossed a line that had never been clearly drawn, but had always existed. And once it was crossed, it couldn't be placed back where it was. The next morning, Elena moved the same way she always had. She woke up early, prepared the space, followed the routine. Nothing in her actions suggested disruption. Nothing in her voice revealed change, but something inside her had shifted, not in a way that could be easily recognized. It wasn't fear. That had already been worn down over time. It wasn't anger. That required energy she had learned to conserve. It was something quieter, more final. A realization that the boundaries she believed existed were never meant to protect her, that the silence she maintained was never going to shield her, that the system she adapted to was never designed for her to belong within it. And once a person understands that, something changes, not on the surface, but at the core. Her movements became more precise, not out of caution, but out of control. Her silence became more deliberate, not out of fear, but out of distance. Her presence remained, but her attachment to that place began to disappear. Because there's a difference between staying somewhere and still being part of it. And Elena was already leaving, long before she ever walked out the door. The next morning, she still showed up. At the same time, through the same entrance, with the same quiet presence that never demanded attention. Nothing about her arrival suggested change, no hesitation at the door, no pause in her steps, just continuity. The kind that makes everything feel unchanged, still worked, still stayed quiet. The floors were cleaned with the same precision, the kitchen arranged the same way, every object returned to its place, as if nothing had ever disrupted the order of that house. And to anyone watching from the outside, that would have been enough. Proof that everything was still intact, that whatever had happened had passed. But something had changed. Not in a way that could be seen, Not in a way that left evidence, but in a way that altered everything, beneath the surface. Not her routine, her tolerance. There's a difference between enduring something and accepting it. For a long time, Elena had endured, silently, carefully, with the belief that staying was necessary, that adapting was survival. But now, something had shifted. The same words were spoken to her. "Clean this. You missed a spot. Don't touch that," and she responded, exactly as before. But the meaning behind her response was no longer the same, because she wasn't internalizing it anymore, where those words once settled inside her, shaping how she saw herself. They now passed through her, uncollected, unstored, observed, but not absorbed. That shift, small as it seemed, changed everything. The children still tested her, still created small disruptions just to watch her correct them. A glass tipped over, a chair moved out of place. A deliberate mess left behind. They waited for the same reaction, the same quiet compliance, and they got it. But something about it felt different. Not slower, not careless, just detached. She no longer moved with the need to prove anything. No urgency to be approved, no effort to meet expectations that were never clearly defined. She completed what was in front of her and moved on. And because she didn't resist, didn't react, didn't break the pattern, no one noticed the change. Because people don't often recognize when they've lost influence. They recognize conflict, they recognize resistance, but quiet withdrawal goes unnoticed. Days continued, the same schedule, the same structure, the same predictable flow of a house that believed it understood itself. But Elena was no longer part of that understanding. She had begun to separate herself, internally, step by step, moment by moment, not through action, but through realization. The house no longer defined her position, it only reflected it, and once she saw that clearly, staying became optional. Weeks passed, nothing dramatic, no buildup that could be tracked, no visible tension that suggested something was about to end, just time, moving forward, until one day, it stopped including her. A few weeks later, she was gone. No warning, no gradual distancing that could be noticed in hindsight, no final moment that stood out as significant. Just a point where her presence ended. Her room was empty, not disturbed, not rushed. Everything had been removed with care, as if the decision to leave had been made long before the act itself. No explanation, nothing written, nothing left behind to interpret, no words to revisit, no closure to hold on to, just absence. And absence, when it comes from someone who is never fully seen, doesn't create noise. It settles quietly. At first, nothing changed. The house continued. Another person stepped in. The same instructions were given, the same expectations repeated. The system remained functional. Because systems like that are designed to continue, not to question. And still, no one chased it. No one asked where she went. No one paused long enough to consider why. No one retraced the moments that led to her leaving. Because to them, she had always been replaceable. And when something is seen that way, its disappearance rarely feels urgent, but absence doesn't disappear. It shifts. It changes form. It moves from presence into consequence. Time passed, quietly, uninterrupted. Days became months, months became years, and slowly, without drawing attention to itself, something began to take shape beyond the walls of that house, not visible to them, not connected to their routine, but real. Because while they continued forward, believing nothing had changed, Elena did, completely. And when that change finally returned, into their line of sight, it wouldn't ask to be acknowledged. It would demand it, and by then, there would be nothing left to fix, only something to face. Years passed, not marked by milestones anyone chose to remember, not defined by moments that demanded reflection, just time, moving forward in the background, reshaping everything without asking for permission. The house remained, untouched in all the ways that mattered to the people inside it. Maintained, orderly, predictable. It continued to function exactly as it always had. Rooms filled, rooms emptied, voices carried, doors opened and closed on schedule. From the outside, nothing had changed, but time doesn't work on surfaces. It works underneath. And underneath, things were no longer the same. Elena had faded from daily thought, not intentionally, not out of effort, just naturally, because absence, when it isn't questioned, becomes normal. She turned into something less immediate, a passing reference, a half-remembered detail. Someone used to work here. She left, didn't she? No one followed the thought far enough to complete it, because completing it would require looking back, and looking back was never necessary. So life continued. The system adjusted. Another presence filled the role she once occupied. The same instructions were given, the same expectations repeated. Everything appeared stable, until one afternoon, something unfamiliar entered that stability. A sleek black car stopped in front of the house. It didn't arrive with urgency, no sudden movement, no unnecessary sound, just a controlled presence, placed with intention. It came to a stop, exactly where it needed to. And then, silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that creates space, the kind that makes a moment feel slightly out of place. The house didn't react immediately, because unfamiliar things don't always register right away. But something about it lingered. The same house, where she once stood outside, waiting. That gate had been more than an entrance. It had been a boundary, a quiet line that defined where she belonged and where she didn't. She used to pause there, not out of habit, but out of understanding, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be allowed in. Now, the gate stood open. No one had announced it. No one had made a decision. It was simply open, and that small detail carried more meaning than it appeared to. The car door opened, slowly, not delayed, but unhurried. A driver stepped out first, composed, precise. His movements were controlled, not by caution, but by awareness. He walked to the rear door, opened it, and stepped aside. Not forward, not involved, just aside. Because whatever was about to step out didn't require assistance. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, she stepped out. At first, there was no immediate recognition. Not because she was unrecognizable, but because she didn't match the version that existed in memory. Memory had preserved her differently, smaller, quieter, contained within the role she once occupied, but the person who stood there now wasn't contained by anything. Elena. The name existed, but it no longer carried the same meaning. Her posture wasn't adjusted. There was no careful positioning, no subtle attempt to reduce her presence. She stood fully, not in defiance, not in performance, just completely. Her movements followed, measured, unrestricted. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't pause to read the environment, because she already understood it, not from observation, from experience. She had lived within its structure, learned its limits, adapted to its expectations. And now, she stood outside of all of it, the same ground beneath her feet, the same entrance ahead, the same house that once required her to wait, to be allowed in. Now, held no control over her presence. She didn't look up immediately, didn't scan for recognition, didn't seek acknowledgement, because this time, she didn't need to be seen to exist, and that was the difference. The air shifted, subtly, not enough to be named, but enough to be felt, because something had returned, not as it was, but as something else entirely. And slowly, recognition began to form, not in words, not in sudden realization, but in the quiet understanding that the past was no longer where they left it. It had moved, grown, changed, and now it stood in front of them, with nothing left to prove. Time hadn't just passed. It had rewritten everything. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, the balance shifted. Completely. And for the first time, the house was no longer in control of the story. Elena? The name stayed in the air longer than it should have, not because it echoed, but because it no longer belonged to the same place it once did. There was a time when that name carried instruction, expectation, immediate response. Now, it carried uncertainty. The voice didn't move forward. It paused, as if even the person who spoke it wasn't sure what would happen next. The voice was unsure now. Smaller, not quieter, but diminished. Because authority, when it loses its position, doesn't disappear immediately. It lingers, but it changes. And this was what it looked like. Elena didn't respond, not because she didn't hear it, but because she chose not to answer it the way she once would have. She let the moment breathe. Not out of hesitation, not out of confusion, out of control, because for the first time, she decided when the moment would move. She looked around slowly. Her gaze moved across the space, not searching for anything new, but recognizing everything that had already existed. The same walls, the same arrangement, the same structure that once defined her position without ever explaining it. She had memorized this place once, not out of attachment, but out of necessity. Every corner, every sound, every shift in tone that signaled when to move and when to disappear. And now, standing in the same place, those details felt different, smaller, contained, as if they had lost the ability to define anything beyond themselves. I used to try so hard to be enough here, she said. Her voice carried no strain, no tension. It didn't rise to match the moment. It didn't soften to avoid it. It stayed exactly where it needed to be. I thought if I worked harder, stayed quieter, maybe you'd treat me like I mattered. The words moved through the space evenly. No emphasis, no dramatization. Because truth, when it has been understood fully, doesn't need to be performed. It only needs to be spoken. And for the first time, they were listening, not casually, not partially, completely, because now there was no version of her they could dismiss, no role they could place her back into, no distance they could use to avoid what was being said. We didn't realize the interruption came quickly, instinctively, as if the moment itself needed to be corrected, as if reshaping the narrative could somehow reduce its impact. But Elena lifted her hand slightly, a small movement, measured, enough to stop everything. And it did. Immediately. No resistance, no continuation, just silence. You did. 2 words. Nothing added, nothing expanded, because nothing needed to be. The truth didn't require explanation. It had already been lived, and once something has been lived long enough, it doesn't need to be argued. It stands on its own. Silence followed, not empty. Heavy, because silence in that moment wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of understanding, the kind that arrives all at once, but far too late. The man stepped forward. The movement was careful, not because he lacked confidence, but because he no longer controlled the space he was stepping into. There was a hesitation in the distance he chose to close, as if something inside him recognized a boundary that hadn't existed before. Let me fix this, whatever it takes. The words were direct, clear, carrying intention, but intention, without timing, loses its meaning, because what is offered after the moment has passed is no longer the same thing. It becomes something else, a reaction, not a choice. Elena looked at him, fully, without avoidance, without resistance. Just clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when nothing is left unresolved within. She saw him exactly as he was, not as he had once appeared, not as he now wanted to be seen, but as he had always been. Elena gave a soft, distant smile. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was detached, as if the moment they were standing in no longer belonged to her. "There was a time I needed that," she said. Her voice remained steady, unchanged, not influenced by what was being offered, because what she needed had already existed in a different time, a time that could no longer be reached. "You missed it." The words settled into the space slowly, not because they were delayed, but because they carried weight, final weight. They marked a point that couldn't be crossed back over, a moment that had already closed, long before this conversation began. Silence returned, but this time, it felt complete. Not waiting, not open, closed. Because there was nothing left to continue, no argument left to make, no explanation left to give, only acceptance. The man didn't step forward again. He stopped, not by choice, but by realization, because somewhere in that moment, he understood. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that what he was trying to reach was no longer available, and the others stood still, not speaking, not reacting, because there was no position left to take. The structure they had relied on no longer applied, and without it, they had nothing to stand behind. Elena didn't move immediately. She remained there, not to prolong the moment, but to complete it, because some endings require stillness, a final acknowledgement that something is over, not just physically, but completely. And as she stood there, calm, unaffected, unreachable, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't about forgiveness, it wasn't about revenge, it was about distance. A distance built slowly, through moments dismissed, through silence accepted, through value never given when it mattered most. And once that distance is fully formed, it doesn't close, it settles, permanent. And in that space, there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to return to, only something to accept. Too late. "I didn't come back for revenge," she added. The words settled gently, not sharp, not forceful, but clear, because revenge would have required something from them. Reaction, regret, a response strong enough to balance what had been done, and she wasn't looking for any of that. "I came back to see if I'd feel anything." That was the truth beneath everything. Not anger, not closure in the way they understood it. Just a question. One she had carried quietly, for longer than they could imagine. Would this place still have any hold on her? Would standing here again bring something back? A memory, a reaction, a feeling she hadn't fully let go of. She paused, not because she needed time, but because the answer had already arrived. She looked at them, one last time, not the way she used to. Not carefully, not cautiously, but directly, fully, as they were, without the structure that once protected them, without the roles that once defined them. Just people, standing in a moment they could no longer control. She saw everything clearly now. The distance, the hesitation, the quiet shift in their posture, the way their certainty had been replaced with something else. Something smaller. And for a brief moment, it could have meant something. Once. But now, it didn't. Nothing. That was what she felt. No weight, no pull, no connection to the place that once held so much of her. No need to stay, no reason to look back, just stillness. "Now I know. I don't." The words were soft, but final, not open for interpretation, not waiting for response, just a quiet conclusion to something that had already ended long ago. And just like that, she turned away. No hesitation, no pause to reconsider, no glance over her shoulder, because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her anymore. Her steps were steady, unhurried, not driven by the need to leave, but by the understanding that she had already left, a long time ago. The distance between them increased, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to make it clear that the moment had ended. Behind her, no one spoke, not because they didn't have words, but because words no longer had a place in what had just happened. The house stood the same, unchanged, but something within it had shifted permanently, not visible, but real. Because sometimes the greatest change isn't what happens in a place, it's what leaves it, and what never returns. She reached the car. The driver opened the door, the same quiet precision, the same controlled movement, but this time there was no contrast. Because she no longer stood between two worlds, she belonged entirely to one. She entered the car, without looking back. The door closed, softly, and in that moment, everything that had once connected her to that place ended. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The car pulled away, slowly, leaving behind the same house, the same structure, the same people, but not the same reality. Because something had been revealed, something they couldn't undo, not what they had done, but what they had lost. And as the car disappeared, one thing became clear. She hadn't come back to reclaim anything. She came back to confirm that there was nothing left to reclaim. And now, she was gone again. But this time, not as someone who was overlooked, as someone who could never be reached again. Be careful how you treat people when they have nothing, because nothing doesn't mean they'll stay that way. Sometimes it's just a phase, a moment, a position they're passing through. But how you treat them in that moment stays. Elena left with nothing, no recognition, no apology, just experience. And over time, that became everything. Because one day, they might have everything, and you'll be left with something far worse than loss, regret. The kind that doesn't go away, the kind that reminds you had a chance and missed it. So the next time someone stands in front of you with nothing to offer you, remember this. You're not just meeting who they are now, you're meeting who they're becoming. And if stories like this stay with you, click the subscribe button, because some stories aren't just told, they're remembered.